welcome to A Game for Your Thoughts. Today we're talking about Resident Evil 4. So Resident Evil 4 is kind of a continuation of Leon Kennedy's story. It continues the Resident Evil franchise in a few different places. The biggest thing is kind of the way it presents itself and the way that the game plays. But I want to mostly talk about the story for a second real quick, and then we'll jump into the gameplay. So the story of Resident Evil 4 follows Leon Kennedy several years after the Raccoon City incident. He's now working for the government, and he's actually kind of like a Secret Service kind of dude. But the president's daughter has gotten kidnapped by a European cult, so he has to go out to this European village and find Ashley, the president's daughter, and bring her back. But of course, it's not that simple. So Leon is one of my favorite characters from the Resident Evil franchise, if probably not my favorite. Jill Valentine's great, but I love Leon Kennedy and I loved his story in Resident Evil 2. So it was great to kind of see what he was up to see what he was doing. And it doesn't necessarily, you don't need to play any of the other earlier Resident Evil games. It does a great job of kind of summing it all up. So if this is your first Resident Evil experience, it's a great place to start. And the story does a good job of bringing itself into the Resident Evil lore. I mean, up to this point, it's all been like the T virus and how that's done stuff, but this introduces something new called the Las Plagas. And it's a very interesting take on the Resident Evil series because it's not necessarily centered around Umbrella and some things like that. There's something a little bit different going on. And that was really cool to see something kind of fresh, something different than what we'd previously seen. And the game does a great job of introducing all this information. It throws it at you in like several different ways, whether it's like cutscenes or you find pieces of documents laying around, kind of in Resident Evil fashion. I mean, you definitely kind of have to dig to get as much lore as possible. You have to find all the pickups and read them, and it's great, and you can go back and reread all this stuff. And I liked how this game presented itself. It does a great job of presenting you the information. It's like, yeah, this is something new, but we're not going to not explain it. It does a great job of explaining it, and it feels like it fits very well into the Resident Evil franchise. Resident Evil isn't known for its fantastic writing, and Resident Evil 4 is certainly no exception. The writing isn't spectacular, and it's not the best thing ever, but it does the job. It gets the job done. There are stupid one-liners, but it kind of knows what it is. It doesn't take itself too terribly serious when it means to, and I really like just the tone and the pace because it knows what kind of game it is. It knows it's not this super serious survival horror game, kind of like Resident Evil 1 was. I mean, it was pretty serious. Resident Evil 4 definitely kind of has some weird charm mixed into it too, and it's great as it just doesn't take itself too terribly serious but also knows when it needs to get serious. So the gameplay is what I really wanted to talk most about, and I'm very excited to talk about it because I mean, everybody and their grandma has talked about Resident Evil 4. I mean, it's the best game in the franchise, considered to some, and one of the greatest games of all time. And I certainly would not disagree with either of those things. My personal favorite's Resident Evil 1. I just love what that game did for the survival horror franchise, and just what a fun, replayable, awesome experience that is. But Resident Evil 4 was not what I was expecting. So one of the best things about the original Resident Evil is the way it built tension in so many different ways, and like the way that the enemies moved and the camera placement and the controls and your inventory management. It built a lot of tension in a lot of ways. Resident Evil 4 still does that, but it does it in a more action-oriented way. The series took a 180. Like I said, it did a 180 with Resident Evil 4, making it more action-oriented, which led to Resident Evil 5 and 6, which wasn't a good thing. Resident Evil 4 does something. It blends the two. It blends survival horror and action into this perfect equilibrium of action survival horror. It does a fantastic job of building tension in a lot of different ways, and it does a fantastic job of introducing or continuing many survival horror things you've seen, like resource management and inventory space and things like that. And it does a fantastic job of making these two blend together, that one's not fighting the other for the other. The action's not too much that it doesn't feel like a survival horror, and the survival horror isn't taking over too much that it's like there's no action. Because this game has plenty of action. There's so much action in this game that you could easily say it's an action game, because it is. So the way the game works is it's now a third-person behind-the-shoulder camera game, and it's actually one of the very first over-the-shoulder third-person shooter games, and it's great. It does a fantastic job because, like I said, it blends action and horror, and that's a lot of what I'm going to kind of talk about here. So it has the camera behind your back. Now it's not set in corners of the rooms or certain camera angles to only give you certain views of the area. Now it's right on your back. When I say right on your back, I mean right on your back. You're getting like the closest up as you can on Leon's back without it having literally be like a shoulder mounted GoPro. I mean, you're right on Leon's back, which is great because it still lets you see the action in front of you. It still lets you get that third person shooter excitement, but it kind of blinds you. You have blind spots, so now you can't really, you got to make sure you're watching your sides. You can't just focus forward. There, it is pretty streamlined, but you still got to make sure you're watching your sides and your backs. Enemies can still sneak up on you, and that's where it gets a lot of tension, is you just don't really know what's behind you or to the side of you, which can hinder the gameplay, but also adds a lot of great tension, making this blend awesome survival horror, and action. The next thing this game does is it's very stationary and slow. It's not a very fast game. The enemies and Leon himself are pretty slow. I mean, you can move kind of quick. There's like a sprint button that makes you move a little bit quicker, but the controls and the way Leon moves, it's pretty stiff. And same thing with the enemies. They're very like stiff. And when you're aiming, you can't move. Once you start aiming, you're stationary and you can't move at all. And it's great because it puts you in situations where you're like, I got to move, but I got to get these shots off, but also adds some great tension because you're trying to move and dodge, but also you're trying to line up your shots. And like I said, it's got inventory management and resources, so you can't waste a bunch of ammo. There's not that much ammo laying about. Even on the pretty easy difficulty, I still found myself like, I am out of ammo, and this is not good. Another thing this game does that I wasn't necessarily a big fan of at first, but kind of by the end I was kind of over it and I was like, whatever, was the quick time events. At first you're like running, you're like walking along, and all of a sudden these guys are like, push down that boulder, and then all of a sudden it's like mash X, and then like you have to like push some button, jump out of the way, and it's like, whoa, okay. And for the first several quick time events, you're like still trying to figure it out, but then by the end you figure out that it's only two combinations of different buttons. It's usually like mash square. I played on the PlayStation 4. You mash square, and then it's like square and X, and L2 and R2 is like the two different combinations, so you can kind of get ready on either one. So by the end of the game, I was kind of fine with the quick time events, but it also made you be very attentive, like during the cutscenes. Like I do this thing where I'm nervous, and I kind of just like look around and stuff, and I was very nervous when I was playing this game because I was kind of like, ooh, what's happening? And I was like watching a cutscene, and then all of a sudden it's like L2, R2, and I was like, what? And then like Leon gets like his neck slit open, and I was like, whoa, okay, I wasn't ready for that. So then you just have to make sure you're very attentive when you're playing this game. You can't just relax when you're playing this. You got to focus up, man. The next thing that Resident Evil 4 does that changes a lot is the puzzle solving. Resident Evil 1, I would say, is a giant puzzle. There's just zombies in the way. Resident Evil 4, I'm going to be honest, I don't even remember any puzzles. I think, well, there's the one in the church with the stained glass, and that's kind of it. Other than that, the puzzle solving is basically non-existent, and if it's there, it's very streamlined. It's very straightforward. Puzzle solving is completely different in Resident Evil 4. It keeps the action tone very quick, but also keeps the slow Resident Evil survival horror feel, but it doesn't slow it down with puzzles. It doesn't slow down that action to make space for a puzzle. I kind of appreciated it when you're looking at the action way, but when you're looking at the survival horror Resident Evil feel that you know and love, the puzzle solving is not going to do it for you in Resident Evil 4. It's basically non-existent. I don't think I ever had to look up anything. And I mean, Resident Evil 1, you're like, okay, how do you make V-Jolt? Resident Evil 4 is a very streamlined, linear experience, making it very suited for the action that it presents. So, in the end, all these gameplay things come together to make a very streamlined action experience with survival horror elements kind of tossed in. You know, it's like when you're making cookies, you're like, I want some M&Ms, and you like throw some M&Ms in there. It's like, ooh, these M&Ms and chocolate chips mix very well. It's a great cookie. That's a great analogy right there. Survival horror and action are the chocolate chips and the M&Ms, and Resident Evil's the cookie. And you throw the chocolate chips and the M&Ms in, and you got a perfect blend of two very different things, but they work very well together. There's certain elements that blend together, like the chocolate and the M&Ms, but you got that candy shell of the survival horror, but it blends very well with the chocolate chips, making a very delicious cookie. That was a great analogy. Go me. I'm going to be honest, it took me a very long time to finally play this game. I mean, I've been playing Resident Evil for a long time, and I just barely like finished Resident Evil 4 like a week ago. And so it's just like, this game took me a long time, so I've had so much like expectations and stuff. Everybody was like, this is the best game ever, best Resident Evil. And I was like, no way, Resident Evil 1 is like the bomb. And I went into this thinking like, okay, what is this going to be like? I'm like, why is everybody so into it? And I can see why. It does a fantastic job of making a delicious M&M cookie that is so much excitement packed into one thing, but it's so much fun and it works very well. It's different than what you know of Resident Evil. It's different than what you know of a basic cookie. It's not just a chocolate chip cookie anymore. There's M&Ms thrown in there. Okay, it works really well, making this one of the best action games, one of the best survival horror games, and one of the greatest games of all time. This game's graphics didn't make it the greatest game of all time. The graphics are kind of fuzzy. I mean, they're not the greatest looking things ever, and especially some of the cutscenes are very okay. They definitely look GameCube-ish, but it's just a port. It's not technically a remake, but it still looks pretty great, but it's the gameplay and the way that it alternated something you were familiar with. You're familiar with your survival horror Resident Evil experience, and it changed it but still felt comfortable and familiar for those who like Resident Evil. I can certainly see why people think this is the greatest Resident Evil game of all time, and one of the greatest games of all time, of course. But looking at the Resident Evil franchise, this game does a great job of taking what made Resident Evil and throwing some other stuff in there to make it just as good, if not better. And of course, it's all personal opinion. If you think Resident Evil 4 is the greatest game of all time and you hate the original Resident Evils because they're too slow and puzzle-like and like fixed camera angles and tank controls, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I can see why people love Resident Evil 4 as much as they do. I'm still a Resident Evil 1 purist. I love that game to death, and I still think it's one of my favorite games of all time and the greatest Resident Evil game of all time. But Resident Evil 4 did something very, very different with the franchise, and I appreciate it. I respect the hell out of it for doing what it did. It did something very unexpected, and it worked. They landed it, especially with what development this game went through. It went through a lot to get to where it was, and it works great. So, in the end, to kind of wrap it all up, what do I think about Resident Evil 4? Well, I think it succeeds at exactly what it wanted to do. It wanted to take a survival horror franchise and move it more towards the direction of action, but it keeps it familiar. It keeps it something you know and you're comfortable with. You're comfortable with survival horror. You've played action games before, and it does a fantastic job of blending both of them. I don't think very many games have done that very well, and if they have, they don't succeed as well as Resident Evil 4 does. Resident Evil 4 does a fantastic job of blending two different genres together to make one really great game. So in the end, yeah, I absolutely recommend Resident Evil 4. If you like Resident Evil and you just never happen to pick up Resident Evil 4, give it a shot. You might be super into it, or maybe you might just not like it at all. You're like, wow, I definitely don't like the action. If you've never played a Resident Evil game, Resident Evil 4 is a great place to start. I would still absolutely recommend the first one, but you can't go wrong with number 4. They're just two very different experiences, and it kind of just depends on how you want to introduce yourself to the series. If you want to be one of the more action people, or if you want like the core survival horror Resident Evil thing. So in the end, yes, I absolutely recommend Resident Evil 4. I would agree it's one of the greatest games of all time. I personally wouldn't put it in my top 10. I would probably put Resident Evil 1 in top 5. But Resident Evil 4 certainly is an experience that's worth your while, it's worth your time, and it's absolutely worth your money. This is a game that has gone down in history as one of the greatest, and I think it will continue to do so for all time and eternity. It did a fantastic job of doing something that was very hard to do, and they succeeded with flying colors, making this one of the greatest games of all time. Hey, thank you so much for watching my video on Resident Evil 4. That was a roller coaster of a video, but I feel like it was absolutely one that needed to be made. So, thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you see, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to get notified every time I post a new video. And down in the comments, let me know what's your favorite Resident Evil game. I really, like I said, the first one, great. Resident Evil 2 Remake, great. Resident Evil 4, great. They're all good, but I'd personally say Resident Evil 1 is the best. But let me know what you guys think. And also, let me know something else cool about Resident Evil. What's your favorite character? What's your favorite place? I don't know, something cool about Resident Evil. Let's talk Resident Evil. But if you like me and you want to see more of me, head over to twitch.tv/thegameforyourthoughts to watch me stream. I'm streaming there all the time. Come say hi, say what up, watch me play some more fun games, and interact. That would be great. I love it when people stop by and say hi. You guys are the coolest. So thank you so much for watching my Resident Evil 4 review. I hope you liked it, and we'll catch you guys next time on A Game for Your Thoughts.